I'm Sarah Zeiler. I'm the Executive Director for the John Sutter Cancer Center here in Des Moines, and I'm also a board member for the Iowa Cancer Consortium. And I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker. Dr. Mónica Ramírez-Andreotta is a professor and distinguished scholar of environmental science and public health at the University of Arizona. Using an environmental justice framework and participatory research methods, she investigates contaminant exposure pathways and communication strategies to translate environmental health research to action and strive for structural change. Please help me welcome Dr. Ramirez-Andreotta.
All right. Hello and good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you all today. My presentation title is Promoting Equity-Centered Communication, Participatory Research at the Intersection of Environmental Health, Life Stage, and Culture. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the majority of this work takes place in Arizona, and Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes. In Tucson, which is where I was born and work at the University of Arizona, is home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Before I also acknowledge that my sincere gratitude to the community scientists and students for their engagement, time, and contributions, recognizing that co-creation and collaborating with all community members has been a privilege. I want to also recognize the variety of different community partnerships and partners that are crucial for this work. The promotoras, or the community health workers, for their pivotal role in recruitment, training, and ongoing commitment. And also Maria de Rocio Estrella Sanchez for invaluable linguistic translations, ensuring that the research is accessible and inclusive. The learning objectives for today that I'm very excited to go into more depth is to be able to summarize why public participation can improve research and communication efforts by increasing environmental health data and visual literacy and combating misinformation. I also want to ensure that you learn and understand and value how participatory research and data report back can connect with what we call existing funds of knowledge and integrate multiple ways of knowing to then build environmental health data and visual literacy, a new relationship to science, and to build historically underserved and underrepresented communities' relationship to science. And by the end of the talk, I hope that you're excited about a community-driven model of science and report back that doesn't only support individual learning, but lays the foundation to address information disparities and social transformation. So there's a lot to go into detail. Community-based participatory research, I taught a whole semester class on community-based participatory research, but I want to make sure just to ground us in some of these participatory methodologies. And so CBPR, maybe you've heard of that acronym, is an equitable partnership that balances research and action in a way that's beneficial to all partners. So we all strive to achieve community-based participatory research. And one methodology that can be used, or something that's acknowledged, is public participation in scientific research. So if we were to take the steps in scientific research, the goal is to consider in the work that you do the different ways in which community members and community organizations and champions can be engaging in these different stages of the process. And so what I'll do today is go through some of these stages and show examples. Another framework that I think applies very well to work around environmental health is looking at what's called equity-centered community design. And this is something that was a graphic that was designed by Creative Reaction Lab, and you can look up their field guide. But the reason why I like showing this is that you see with the steps here of like the first step in this experience is to build partnerships and define that research question together. You can see here with equity-centered design, at the core of it is understanding the scenario in which you're trying to achieve or understand, and then the outer circle around history and healing, acknowledging and dismantling power constructs, and then working in these different frameworks from inviting diverse co-creators, building humility, defining that topic, and then working through these different steps. And so I'm introducing some frameworks or like approaches to research, right? Community-based participatory research, which is like that equitable, all people sitting at the table together, really striving to translate research to action, looking at public participation in scientific research. How can community members be engaged in the different steps of the research process? And then an equity-centered design that very much looks at the unique situation and place-based scenario. And so the work I'll present today is going to be a mixture of co-created community science, so engaging community members in most of the steps of scientific research, and using an equity-centered community design approach, which is place-based with the recognition of history, healing, and power dynamics. One thing you'll also hear me talk about is striving for environmental health literacy. And so Gray et al. Did a review article acknowledging what are the dimensions of environmental health literacy. So bringing different studies together to define this term. And what you see here are these three concentric circles. You try in the center, you're building awareness and knowledge, in this case around environmental exposures and the social cultural dynamics. The next outer circle is skills and self-efficacy. So building an individual's capacity to take on health protective decisions. And then community change. So resulting from actions to reduce harmful exposure and protect health. And so for today, what I'll be acknowledging is building data, environmental numeracy, and visual literacy, thinking about environmental health action. And when I say self-efficacy, right, that's the sense of control one has over their experience and taking an ability to do something and take action. And then community change is looking at that building of communities together, social transformation, and truly addressing information disparities. All right, so let's jump in. So the first, so what I'll do is I'm going to give you examples of the first three, acknowledging that all of this begins with listening and humility. So I'm coming from Arizona, and so I'm going to give you examples from Arizona, which has a copper star in their flag. And so I work with a lot of different communities that neighbor toxic release inventory sites or resource extraction in the form of copper mining. And so one thing everybody can do, right? This was an important amendment to the Superfund Act or the CERCLA Act, was to community members have the right to know. So all of us can look up the toxic release inventory toxic tracker to get a summary of these sites within our community, state, and country. So what I'm showing you here is the map of sites within the state of Arizona. And so the larger the circle, the more toxic release by facility. And so over the last decade, I've been working alongside community members in these either neighboring resource extraction, a toxic release inventory, and or combined suffering from some type of environmental injustice. And acknowledging here that the sites that have these larger circles are mining. In this case, you could imagine if you were to go to these sites, you would see crushing and grinding. You would see slag dumps, potentially smelting. But one of the things we're very concerned about in Arizona, because we're arid and semi-arid, is this wind erosion of mine tailings or mining waste. This material is flour-like. It's fine particles that readily move with wind and water. And so if you were to live in these areas, you might see something like this. These are the mine tailings piles themselves. You can see the home at the base of a mine tailings pile, and you can see an active mine in one of the communities. And so over the years, I've worked with communities to basically meet people where they are, listen, and be invited. So a lot of times I get asked, how does all this start? And the way it starts is by being available, operating with that culture of humility and listening. And so I've had the honor of being invited into these different spaces and listening, and where community members have brought up these different types of topics and community needs. And so you see the list here around soils. Can I grow and consume locally grown foods? Is my air safe to breathe? What's in this settled indoor and outdoor dust? Again, being in an arid and semi-arid region, we have a lot of We have dust and challenges around what is settling in and around the home. Community members are trying to do the right thing by harvesting rainwater to reduce their water footprint, but they're concerned about what could be in that rainwater and how to use it. And one in California, I worked with a community-based organization to look at their question around if the elevated breast cancer rates were due to metalloid exposures, specifically arsenic and cadmium. Recently, and what I'll talk a little bit more about today is like how we're having these climate extremes and compound events around wildfires and then subsequent wind and water erosion leading to contaminant exposures, and how wildfires and flash flooding could be affecting soil and air quality. So over the years, I've designed different programs. It seems pretty powerful to kind of name these programs, and so I have acknowledging, right, like Garden Roots was one of the first ones, then following up with Project Harvest, Rethinking Wildfires, Floods, and Health, and then STEAM in Action. So I'll go through, what I'm going to do today is give you a variety of examples from my experience so that hopefully there's experiences that you can take away and apply within your community. So going back to, so with this said, of these different co-created community science programs, the idea, which is core to this, is inviting those diverse co-creators. And so in this work, right, when you're in this co-creation process, you're engaging people who have different intersectionalities or a variety of intersectionalities. In my experience, these intersectionalities might be around limited income, limited college degree, historically underrepresented, underserved, rural populations, and their dominant language might be Spanish. And so the Spanish is usually a little bit more in Tucson, but regardless is acknowledging, right, that these individuals and communities are coming from different places and have different layered experiences that not only perhaps create a vulnerability, but actually also brings in a very important lens and a fund of knowledge that needs to be embraced. One way to ensure this like bridging and what we call like the bidirectional relationship and co-learning is to employ what we call promotoras or community health workers. They're also known as knowledge mediators or knowledge brokers. And so these are individual paid positions where they are place-based. So the promotoras will live within the communities in which you're engaging and working alongside, and they'll serve as that bridge. So they're individuals who have an understanding of the local experience, the idiosyncrasies, the social, cultural, and political climate in the area, and they help to inform the way in which the program's implemented, but also like they are also learning all the different techniques. So there's this like really great relationship with the type of fabric that's developed with these cultural knowledge, with these knowledge brokers. I also want to acknowledge that you can have scholars be cultural knowledge brokers as well. So I myself identify as a cultural knowledge broker because I have lived experience related to those that I'm engaging, and also am, have the knowledge and understanding of environmental health. And so one of your learning objectives is like connecting with existing funds of knowledge within communities. And so I want to acknowledge here that inviting diverse creators, co-creators, allows you to connect with existing funds of knowledge, right? So people like the knowledge within a community and individual, and on top of also working with promotoras or these knowledge brokers, allow you to further connect and grow, again, this fabric of knowledge within communities and across the project. So let's go into an example of a project. Here is this, what I talked about recently about wildfires, rethinking wildfires, floods, and health project. So this is where a community concern was raised in September of 2021. This is where, again, going back to looking at that map around resource extraction and toxic releases, you can see this area that I have circled here. So this is an area that's been where there's active and legacy mining, combined with a large fire that consumed almost 185,000 acres, and with a 37% of a burn severity, of soil burn severity, moderate to high. And then right after this fire, you had these flash flood events. And so where people were reporting ash blackened floodwaters flowing into residential areas. And so this is an example of these compound climate extremes plus the geohazard. So you have the extraction going on in the area, which is, and those different types of like those mine tailing piles, right? You saw that there weren't plants growing on them. They had different topography. Then you have this fire, which changes these, and then you have a burn scar. And so that fire and burn scar changes the soil chemistry. And then you have this flash flood. So then now that burn scar is just going to move readily. All that material is going to move readily and with the water. And then this water impacted these residential areas. And so the community members reached out with concerns around the pollutants they may have washed in with the sediment that settled in their backyards and how the sediment may impact their children and adult chemical body burden due to soil ingestion and inhalation of fine particles over time. So this grant was a time-sensitive award by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, but it was written in partnership with the town of Miami, the Gila County Education Services Adult Education Program, the county, Gila County itself, the city of Globe, and then Miami and Globe community participants. And so I'm highlighting this because from the inception of the work, it was connecting with with community champions and leaders to understand the issue and have their knowledge within the grant. Also, again, just hiring the promotoras and local community members. And then also building out an environmental advisory board. So the advisory board named themselves Copper Valley Community Environmental Board. They were paid for their time and contributions, but ultimately they were bringing their experience and knowledge to the table, and they were also participating in the science. So they're informing the way that the science and the research goes forward, but also what's most importantly, informing how to communicate the data back, which I'll get to. All right, so moving into our next steps of 4 through 8. So I'm not going to give you kind of like nuggets of information throughout this, but if we go back to the Rethinking Wildfires, Floods, and Health project, we can see here that this map is showing the areas that the burn severity, and then it's really hard to see, and I'll zoom in on these, but it's showing like the flood depth, and then the anthropogenic sources or the sources of potential waste that might have influenced the contaminants that we were measuring in the soil and sediment and indoor and outdoor dust. Again, zooming in on this area, this is where we have this heavy amount of resource extraction. And so I'm highlighting, now I'm zoomed in a little bit more and have these insets to show where we collected samples. But again, this talk is about the public participation. And so sampling locations were informed by local community members and the Miami government, the town of Miami's town manager. And so this is very much where we interviewed members of the town council. But the town manager also took us on a site tour. And so all of these places where we ended up sampling was based off of, one, the layering of these maps and information, right? So getting this type of information and building out a map, but also going along and listening to community members' experience and weaving that into the sampling plan. So again, like that involvement of the town government and the town manager improved the research project because it showed we had somebody on site showing us the areas that were impacted and actually even where to sample. We hosted community training. So something big about this project was building capacity. So we wanted to make sure that individuals would be learning how to collect samples and how to interpret their data. And so we built out environmental monitoring training and kits. And so I'm showing here that over the years, we have kits on collecting food for analysis, harvested rainwater, irrigation water, drinking water, surface soils, subsurface soil, sediment samples, as well as collecting dust in different formats. And so here's an example of that instruction manual. And this is an example of them setting up the sampling indoors of looking at settled dust in a designated area, and then gridding the surface soil to collect that soil sample. And so one of the things to highlight here is all this whole step of doing these trainings and building capacity in environmental science, environmental monitoring, and field work is that this is individuals gaining this capacity and bearing witness and collecting the samples themselves allows for the ongoing acceptance and understanding of the data to which they're going to receive. So what I really want to stress here is that co-created process, right? So engaging community members throughout the process, but having community members train and sample is very is a very pivotal experience because they are the ones doing the work to create the data set. And so if they end up having challenges or questions about the data, right, they have to question themselves. And so one of the things I want, so this is acknowledging like this combat around misinformation. So I think that when so imagine, right, so these community members are highly dedicated. They want the right answer and they want to do what's right and figure out what's going on within their home and community. So they do the training and they follow these instructions, or they work side by side with the promotor who helps them sample. And so they're bearing witness to that whole experience. So when they get data that either aligns or contradicts their preconceived notions, there's a difference in the way they accept that information because they are the ones that collected it, right? So they are the scientists in this process. So doing this level of public participation combats misinformation and builds, right, health literacy because they are the ones collecting data and part of the process. So in garden roots, this is an example of like soil sampling. This is like training examples. These are all these beautiful vegetables that community members collected and wanted to look at like the uptake patterns of different metals. Again, they are the ones following the instructions, growing the vegetables themselves, right? They understand all the inputs into the soil and they're collecting and submitting for analysis. In Project Harvest, we had laboratory methodologies. Again, people are learning this, collecting samples. This was like 4 times a year around the major rain events. And then we also had a do-it-yourself portion of the project. So you could either get the lab or the do-it-yourself. This ended up being more of a do-it-together. A lot of people did it with families and it fostered intergenerational learning. But this is where people were following instructions, running the sample, collecting the sample, running the analysis, getting a data point and reporting it back to us. Okay, another project, our soil. So I'm giving you all these examples, right, of like, this is where we've developed screening kits for community members to use, where they collect, prepare, extract, detect, and measure a lead or arsenic concentration, bioavailable lead or arsenic concentration in the soil sample. Again, in this work, it was very much about how do you take all of these laboratory techniques, package them in the way that community organizations can use to start movements around soil health. And so we saw that this type of action was laying the groundwork to address information disparities around soil quality, specifically arsenic and lead, and social transformation by bringing people together to do the science. Okay, so moving into interpreting and drawing conclusions. So one of the, I moved a little quick on that. So steps 8 through 10 are very much about interpreting data, sharing, and discussion. And so I want to spend the rest of the time really highlighting data report back efforts. So what are components of data report back? So in essence, it's making sure that people get their data back in a way that they can use it. What we've seen over the years is when people get their data back, they want to have a description of like, what did you find and how much was in it, right? So how much arsenic was in the soil? Is it high? Is that safe, right? What should I focus my efforts on? Where do those chemicals come from? And then very importantly, providing intervention and prevention strategies with the data set. And so we see that this ends up being a really nice set of practical steps you can take when you're reporting data back, whether it's biomonitoring data or environmental monitoring data. So over the years, I've been co-designing a variety of different bilingual data report back materials. These are just some examples of the hard copy booklet, which we know in some communities is very important to have printed materials, not to just have everything online, even though we do create bilingual interactive websites, which are, again, that interactivity fosters another level of learning and data literacy, but we have seen that depending on your audience, you do need to print that hard copy. So for today, I'm going to highlight a little bit more about Project Harvest and the Rethinking Wildfires, Floods, and Health. So with Project Harvest, we spent a tremendous amount of time acknowledging this like community members' right to design. So co-creating the report back materials. This is where I had my student, former student, was a Master's of Fine Arts, and together her and I worked to create all these different basically data visualizations, and to show and worked with our community advisor, our internal advisory board, external advisory board, promotoras, and a subset of participants, and showed different visualizations to see what people were learning and pulling and which ones that were easier to read, which ones showed enough information. And then, also thinking about like what should be the entry point into the data set. So with Project Harvest, it became very clear that community members' original research question around within Project Harvest was, what is the quality of my harvested rainwater and how can I use it? So we recognize that the entry point into the data set should be, how do you use your water? So with the first thing participants were asked, like first thing you would do when you open up your either your booklet or go through the online experience is you'd be asked like, how do you use your water? And then it'd say, look for the corresponding standard advisory or recommendation or guideline in the graph to see if your rainwater sample is below or above that value represented by a colored line. So that was one thing, is like thinking about what is the user experience with the data set. The other thing was creating this, like, so this is probably like version 17 of all the information that should be represented in one graph for one contaminant. So that was one thing, is like showing one contaminant at a time. Community members collected a rainwater and a field blank sample, so they wanted to see both. Their data point would be highlighted, has different symbology for the rainwater versus field blank. And then we had the line showing the different standards, advisory recommendations, or guidelines. Again, this community-driven model and to co-create really laid the groundwork to address information disparities. We also wanted to test out, so one of the things, I didn't give my full background, but I have a studio art degree and a science degree. And then as a PhD student, I did my PhD in soil, water, and environmental science and did a minor in art. And so I've been consistently bridging and combining art with science throughout my life, right? It's something that I bring to the table and proud of. But acknowledging here is I really wanted to test what happens, right? Hypothesizing that like an environmental art experience would lead to a different outcome. Like getting your data back through environmental art would lead to a different experience than just getting your data back through a traditional kind of graphical experience. And so this is where we tested the outcomes of the graphic or booklet only versus booklet plus, in this case, ripple effect. So acknowledging my former student, who's the first author on these papers, Dorsey Kaufman, is where we had ripple effect. And that's where the data points were converted into sound waves. And so what you have here is just a speaker with a plastic tray with water. And so it would play the sound wave, right, of the chemical concentration. So the higher the concentration, the more water activity you'd see. So you can see here in these visuals. And if it exceeded one of the standards, you would see a light go off. So that's acknowledging Project Harvest, right? This whole like right to design, co-create, going through like 17 versions of a graphic, of a data visualization, and what would work best. And then looking at the intervention of art to communicate all this data back to these diverse co-creators and community scientists. So now let's go to the recent project of rethinking wildfires, floods, and health. This had a different flavor. This is very much where we were like, okay, we're going to work with our board to inform all data report back materials. But I used the same methodology of like showing different visualizations, right? These are all like, different visualizations and ways that data could be reported back so that they could like select and elaborate on ones that they appreciated or thought would work best within and for their community. They also like reviewed all the summary materials. So the plain language summary of the project, the website text, finalized like a graphical version. So in this case, trying to see multiple contaminants side by side was critical was something of interest to this group. And then of course, informing the prevention and intervention efforts. So here's another example of working with the board to lay the groundwork to address this information disparity, but also lead to some form of transformation. And so for this project, you can imagine that we have these advisory board meetings, we're creating visualizations, drafting report back materials, getting feedback, building the booklets, and then hosting community events. So we built out personalized result booklets, also had the bilingual interactive website where participants can choose the language, they can enter their access code, they'll see their data point highlighted among others. And so this is an example of like that little example of that experience. And then also we had the report back gathering. So this is where we shared food, board members presented and opened up, did like an opening statement to the report back gathering. And then if there were values that were elevated or of concern, that was where myself and or the promotora did a one-on-one conversation and follow up with that community member or household. And so again, just acknowledging there was a lot of data to report back. So thinking strategically about how that hard copy booklet might be laid out, and then how that interactive website should look. And so to conclude for today, I'll focus on these, like, how do I know that we saw changes around like literacy? How do we know, how are we able to determine whether the data visualization type impacted learning and emotion and behavioral outcomes? And how these results being translated into action? And so throughout this talk, hopefully you've noticed that these projects are centered around community learning and prioritize the participant experience as well as in general, but also in the practice of data report back. So throughout these types of projects, we are not only doing the environmental monitoring and engagement and training, we're also evaluating how we're doing, right? The implementation of the program. And we're also trying to understand what people are learning and gaining from the work. So we're doing that through surveys, focus groups, follow-up interviews, and a sentiment analysis, which I'll explain. So with Project Harvest, no need to focus fully on this table. What I want to highlight is that they are now water experts. So this project of doing this co-created science and co-creation of the data report back, we saw that by far community members were properly interpreting their data, right? Interpreting and comparing their data to the standards recommendation guidelines that were appropriate and that the action aligned with their data set. We also see that when we look at, this is looking at the difference between those who received the booklet only in the peach color and ripple effect, which is in blue. We can also see that those who, we looked at memory, recall, and action based on how they received their data. And one of the things that's interesting to see here is that we saw more specific recall from those who received the ripple effect experience. And so that was something that we documented and wrote about. When we talk about growing a strong, so this is acknowledging the water experts, that data literacy of properly interpreting, defining, it's based on the evidence that's being presented to them and the action that they take is supported by evidence. This is showing that the art experience enhanced memory recall and their ability to recall their data more specifically. This is 6 to 8 months after, right, they're getting their data set back and having the ripple effect, having the data gathering with the booklet and ripple effect. Now, if we look at this growing a stronger relationship with science. So this is where we surveyed participants. So Project Harvest got interrupted by the pandemic. We had to end early because of the high level of engagement and personal contact. So what we did is we issued a survey. And in that survey, we asked different questions. But we see here that 66% of those who completed the survey felt that their relationship with science had changed because of the project. They specifically indicated that they had more respect for science and the scientific process. And so this is a quote from a community member during a focus group saying, being able to participate in something that's my home and I can see what's happening there, and then getting these types of results that show exactly what's going on is valuable. And that if I had any perceptions that's different than what's in this booklet, I have to reconsider and say, these are the facts. And so I like this quote because it illustrates that this individual is acknowledging the participation. They're seeing what's happening. They're getting data back, which they see as value in and of itself. But they're also saying, if I have any perception that's different, I have to reconsider and say, these are the facts. So this is where the individual is, because of the experience in the project, their mental model around environmental science or pollution in that space, they're allowing new information to connect into that mental model. and they're open to reconsidering, right? And the exposure experience or the environmental pollution experience in this area. So this was very important, this demonstration of a stronger relationship. We also, maybe I'm trying to remember. I feel like this was from so continuing on with growing a stronger relationship. This is these responses to selected survey questions that were ministered between, again, because of the interruption of COVID, we had a survey. And so I'm showing a lot of information here, but what I'm going to have you focus on is the last three. And so what we see here is we asked individuals, right? Like, now that you've been part of Project Harvest, right? And so we can see here that 65%, right? So if we look at, I trust science more, I value my Project Harvest data more now due to COVID. And the last one that's saying, due to my participation in Project Harvest and receiving my result booklets with graphs, I feel more comfortable interpreting COVID-19 data. So what I'm highlighting here is that 65%, 44%, and 61%, right, for those indicated that they agreed or strongly agreed with the statement. But what I really want us to focus in on is that this is where a community health worker, promotora, was like, Mónica, you've been giving this report back, giving people like the booklets, the like online interface with all these graphs. I wonder if they've if that experiences has improved their ability to interpret pandemic data. And sure enough, we see that 61% indicated they agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that their participation in the project and receiving the result booklets made them feel more comfortable interpreting pandemic data. We also had quotes of like, this helped me a lot to read graphs, feel like they're part of something important, recognizing, seeing how science is important to everyday life. I wish more people trusted science and that we had a leader that respected it. So we saw a lot of dialogue around the value of the project. All right, this is the sentiment analysis. So bear with me because I know this was something that was a very cool thing to do. So again, remember I brought up the hypothesis that the communication, that if you communicate the environmental data through an art form, you would see differences in learning, differences in action. And one of the hypotheses was also is that we know that art can elicit emotion. And so here is what's called a sentiment analysis. And so this is actually designed by corporal linguists. Linguists they'll analyze words that people use to understand emotional responses. So we basically took these words so basically we contacted that scientist, they shared their word bank. And so we ran our interviews and focus groups with this like a word library. And so what you can do is you can look at what types of words that are being used and connect them to an emotional response. And so what I'm showing here is what we call violin plots. And so I'll just go through a little bit here where the first one is the violin plot showing the percent of words coded for information states. So again, words that were acknowledged as that would fall under information states. So what we saw here is participants who had a booklet only experience had significantly higher percentage of information states that were passive and using auxiliary verbs, indicating being a state of reporting information. So these were words that were like be, am, is, was, right, or something like. So it's a passive state. We'll call it that. However, when we look at, in this case, this is looking at the type of words for first person. And so we see that art had significantly higher percentage of first person. So that means when the speaker is referring to themselves or the group. So when they're saying I, me, we. And so in this case, we see that the art experience, people actually centered themselves within the data set versus previously with the booklet only, they were more passive in their experience. With the art, they're centering themselves within the data experience and talking about the data set. And then this one, what we're excited about is this meta discourse cohesive. So I know that's a pretty long word to be like, but basically words to build cohesive markers to navigate through what is being said. So these were where we were coded. These words were coded for a metadata discourse cohesive if they were acknowledging the need for elaboration, guidance, interpretation, or clarification. And so we saw a significantly greater use of those words with the art experience. So acknowledging here that these are showing that with art, people centered themselves, and with art, people were building and wanted to do and did more elaboration with one another. When we go back to just the experience as a whole, we saw that with the report back, it was their exposure experience, right, condensed into one visual symbol. And so when people were receiving this data, whether through the graphic or the ripple effect, it was unleashing an oral history, not just about the chemical concentration, but about injustice. So this experience created a platform for people to share their stories about how some areas are the dumping grounds of others. And so you could see this is a quote right below the mine was our school. That was when the smelter didn't have any controls and there would be sulfur smoke coming out of the top of the stack. When it rained, you'd get acid rain. We'd be choking because the fumes were so bad, but it was just part of life. We lived here and accepted it. So here we're acknowledging, like, connecting with existing knowledge and integrating and refining the environmental and pollution experience. Through a focus group, we see that this quote came out. Now we need to see Project Harvest through the lens of the George Floyd protests and systemic racism. How can our citizen science and Project Harvest experience intersect or help address this now? And I bring this quote up because participants are proposing to and asking how to expand our science. They're seeing that our science has a social responsibility. And they're seeing that our science is not perpetuating harm, but it's being seen as a solution. And this highlights the possibility, right, that this highlights a new culture of science and the efficacy the participant had in the co-created process. And so I'm highlighting this because it's, again, this whole process of participation in research, connecting with funds of knowledge, integrating multiple ways of knowing, and then building these new relationships to science. Going through, jumping to a recent project of rethinking wildfires and health, this is where this data set is reported back to all participants and the town government. It's informing local and state programs. We're actually seeing that this data set helped inform in part the mining company to do cleanups in the area, right? So we're seeing the action not only in the individual and community intervention and prevention, but we're sharing data and we're seeing additional testing and cleanup in the area based on this project. And so with the Rethinking Wildfires, Floods, and Health project, I want to acknowledge again that the community was prioritized, community was centered, and data report back was prioritized. And so this community advisory board was established. The results were communicated through what's called a community first bilingual strategy that fostered local engagement, prompted collaborative interventions, and led to tangible outcomes, like I said, including a mining company enrolling in a volunteer remediation program due in part to learning research findings through the public advisory board meetings and on interviewing me for exposure and remediation insights. So wrapping up here, like the summary and practical recommendations is to engage those end users and community members, trusted community members, and co-create data report back materials to address what we call technical elitism and justice challenges. See data report back as a way to connect with existing knowledge, to build literacies across environmental health data and visual, but also new relationships to science. See participatory research and report back as a way to repair historically underserved or underrepresented communities' relationship to science. Incorporate the arts, right? We see here that environmental art can not only communicate complex information, but it can overcome barriers associated with traditional science by affecting people's emotion and memory. And that this work, right, again, going back to one of your learning outcomes, that this community-driven model of science and data report back supports individual learning, which we were able to see, but lays the groundwork for social transformation and structural change. And highlighted here is like these structural change, or like what we call, what CompU et al. Calls the little p, ongoing collaborations, data sharing across agencies, enforcement, testing, and then one of the things I was gonna, but I can talk to you all about another time, is youth data storytelling. But for the sake of today, I don't. I can come back to that. So coming back to your learning objectives, I hope you're able to summarize why public participation in scientific research can improve research and communication. Hope you understand and value how participatory research and data report back can connect with existing knowledge and integrate multiple forms of knowledge to build relationships and new relationships to science, but also building environmental health data and visual literacy. And I hope you're excited about this model because we have the evidence to show that it supports individual learning, but also can lay groundwork for social transformation. Thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. We have one online question, so we're just pulling that up. So Kelly Angel is curious about how many people who already had mistrust in the data became engaged in the work afterward, and was there increased effort to reach people who started in with that mistrust?
So I could hear my echo of going with buying time here to answer that question. So the question was like, can you say it one more time, or is it written somewhere?
Yes. So how many people who already had mistrust in the data became engaged in the work afterward? And then did you specifically focus on efforts to reach people who maybe were more mistrustful?
Yeah, so I understand that question. So I guess I would say that I don't have we didn't have baseline data of like, where we asked them like a pre-survey of like, do you trust science, right? So there wasn't this like numerical of those identifying that, a pre-survey and then a post-survey. What I would say is that in general, we were able to document these increased trusts in science based on the way people used, talked about, and shared their data. And what was the second part of the question?
Were there any specific outreach efforts to reach people who
to reach people? So I think the whole motivation for these projects overall is people are motivated to be part of them because of the research question. So since the research question is stemming from the communities in which you're engaging, they're coming together around the question and coming in with their own hypotheses, right? And so we've been in dialogue around, did the data set like support or reject your hypothesis, right? You can imagine that kind of conversation. But there wasn't like outright recruitment to engage those who already had a mistrust in science.
Hi, Monica. This is Natasha Askelson. Thank you so much for coming back to Iowa. And as a good academic, I don't have a question, I have a comment. I think that Monica's work is a roadmap for those of us in Iowa who are concerned about the environment and are concerned about water. Doing work like this could be really meaningful. And so I would challenge everybody in the room to think about how we can use this as literally a manual for how we could do something similar in Iowa. So thank you so much, Monica, and we'll probably have to have you back to help us with the logistics.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to support in any way that I can.
Hi, is it on? Okay. My name is Roxanne Strike. I am completing my M.P.A, my Master in Public Health, and I'm also a doctoral student studying the intersection of community college and public health outcomes. But as part of my internship, we're actually creating an ambassador program that is very similar to your community health worker programs. And so I was wondering, kind of a two-part question, how long, and I know it's different everywhere, but how long did it take for you to lay the foundation and build that community trust? Especially among marginalized communities, you do see a certain distrust of the scientific and health communities because of, previous harms done to them. And were there any barriers that you faced in getting this program set up, and how did you address those?
Yeah, great questions. So yeah, as you acknowledge, right, like the amount of time isn't like the amount of time varied by community. So I would say like efforts I didn't, with Project Harvest, one of the things that was critical was I had been working with a community-based organization in Tucson, Arizona called the Sonoran Environmental Research Institute. And so they had an established community health worker promotora program. And so I'd worked with them on a previous project, doing trainings for the promotoras. And so that was a relationship that had I started working on that in around 2006. And one thing with Project Harvest is we together with that community-based organization did a climate change environmental resiliency training in Spanish together. And so I was part of that. And so so I would say that was one, building relationships with a community-based organization. And once you had that trust and experience, like continuing to be there and provide support and do trainings together. And so then when it came to that preparing of that grant, it was made sense to like work with them and have them receive a sub award. So that's like kind of for Tucson in the urban areas. And the rural spaces, it's taken different flavors. And so for one community, some of my colleagues had been doing air monitoring at a local school. And it was important to make sure that they received that's all under the umbrella of like a Superfund research program. So looking at, I won't get in the details of that, but it was important to make sure that they were getting that data set back, but also providing opportunities for additional experience. And so in that case, you had a community champion who was the superintendent and the principal of the high school at the time, who was very open to learning about the data, but also very much dedicated to providing hands-on science education for their teachers and for the students. And so that whole relationship started around providing the hands-on continuing education professional development training for their teachers. So he actually paid them to do the Project Harvest environmental health trainings. And we built a demonstration system, rainwater harvesting system at their school for them to use for science experiments. And actually one of I think it was like a third or fourth grader won like the county or state science fair using the rainwater harvesting system. So that's one experience. Another community, this is actually interesting, where community members were very much starting to do more rainwater harvesting. They were very interested in the results, but they're like, hey, let's make sure you talk to the mine first before you start this project. And so that was a very different experience where it's like, okay, I see the culture here. So these community members are like, to work here, it'd be good to make sure the mine's aware, and kind of, in my opinion, it looked like I was like getting the blessing of the mine. But regardless, they got me in front, they got me the meeting with the mining company. I presented the project. And from there, the mine was like, okay, this seems like, let us know if you need anything. Like, this seems like an interesting project. And so the community members these individuals bared witness to the presentation, the mine's reaction, and then we got started there. And then in another community, I would say this is where they've got a designated Superfund site. And the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency at that time, had invited our research program to attend their first community meeting. And that's where I was sitting in the back and just documenting all their questions. So that's how Garden Roots started, was listening. And a lot of questions were around soil and whether they can grow food and how much they can eat. And so after that meeting, I just went up to those community members and said, hey, you have really good research questions. I don't have an answer, but I'm about to start my PhD and I would love to work with you on that. And so I was able to and so that's where it took a couple years for me to get funding for my program and the research project. And that led to that partnership. And I still work with that community today. And that started in 2008. So I guess those are just different examples of what it looked like to build trust. And then I think there was another part to your question around,
challenges.
yeah. So I think you could imagine one of the things with the data, so one thing was, if, a lot of this work, you want to acknowledge and celebrate all your partners and community scientists. In some of these communities, doing environmental monitoring was perceived as against the mine or against, and so that was important to understand. I know that one promotora did get a lot of heat for their role in the project and accused of trying to go against the mine. So that clarification was really important around, this is about achieving environmental health justice for all, trying to understand experiences. So that was a social navigation that we had to work through. People might, yeah. So I would say realizing that tension, realizing that you want consenting people before you acknowledge that they're part of the project. Some people were like, don't let anybody know I'm doing this. Navigating that tension of that perception that the work would be going against the company in the area, and learning how to navigate through that. Being very transparent about the unintentional consequences of the data report back. So when you have your household data, does that put you in any position where you would have to report if you were going to sell your home, and kind of things like that? So I developed an individual results consent form where I would say, if you had your individual results, you might need to disclose under these circumstances. And so I saw that making sure people, that was an important point, to make sure people were aware of that and had it. Those are some examples, right, of challenges I can think of right now.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. But if not, I will plug an art project that is happening here at the conference in honor of the presentation. Nice. So in room 108, the community project is creating a dynamic wing sculpture called Wings Around Town. And so if you go to room 108, you can paint a feather that will be included in the sculpture and displayed around Council Bluffs. So please make sure to stop by room 108. And thank you so much again. We really appreciate it.